I want you to imagine a scenario for a second. You're sitting in a quiet room, completely engrossed in a book.
Oh, that's the best feeling.
Right. It's great. And your eyes are just kind of sweeping across the page, and they cast over a really simple three-letter word, just the word cat.
Okay, yeah.
Almost instantaneously, your brain just conjures up an image. Like you picture a furry little animal, or maybe you hear a faint meow in your mind, or maybe you even imagine the feeling of it brushing against your leg.
It's an entirely automatic reflex.
Exactly. We are so incredibly used to this process that we never, ever stop to question it. I mean, we just assume that words are these transparent little vehicles, right? Just carrying a picture of the real world directly into our brains.
Which is a very natural assumption to make.
But what if I told you that this assumption is actually, well, it's blinding us? What if, depending entirely on the context of the story you're reading, that simple word isn't just pointing to a literal physical animal at all? What if it's actually a tiny interlocking gear in a massive, completely self-contained universe of meaning?
It really is a profound shift in perspective. I mean, when we start looking at how words function in literature, as opposed to, say, how they function in a newspaper or a biology textbook, we realize they're doing something vastly more complex than just pointing at things in the physical world.
And that complexity is exactly what we are plunging into today. So welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Our mission for this conversation is to completely dismantle and then carefully rebuild your entire understanding of how we read. I mean, we're going to explore how meaning is actually created.
It's a big task.
It's huge. And we're going to uncover this secret matrix of symbols, images, and archetypes that honestly, secretly connect every story ever told.
Yeah, and we are basing our journey today on a brilliant, though incredibly dense essay titled Ethical Criticism, Theory of Symbols.
Dense is the right word for it.
It really is. But it's the kind of foundational material that makes you realize you've just been looking at the surface of the ocean your whole life, Totally unaware of the massive architecture of the deep water right beneath you.
Oh, totally.
So just to give you a sense of where we're going today, we aren't just going to list off a bunch of boring literary terms. We are going to follow a very specific trajectory, kind of moving from the microscopic all the way to the cosmic.
Right, starting small.
Exactly. We'll start by looking at a single word and the literal way it behaves on a page. And then from there, we'll step back to see how words form images, and we'll confront this very common, honestly, almost instinctual trap we all fall into as readers.
Oh, the author intention thing.
Yes, obsessing over what the author intended to say. And finally, we will pull all the way back to the widest possible lens, where we discover that poetry and literature aren't just isolated stories. They actually form this vast, interconnected network built out of ancient human rituals and dreams.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I love that this overarching theory doesn't begin with some incredibly abstract, untouchable concept. It actually starts with a very practical, almost universally frustrating problem.
Yeah, it really does.
A problem about the basic vocabulary we have available to us when we want to just talk about books.
What's fascinating here is that we don't even have a good, universally accepted noun for a work of literary art. I mean, think about it. In music, we have terms like sonata or symphony or concerto, right?
Right.
And those clearly define the structure of what we're listening to. But in literature, what do we actually have?
Well, I mean, we have poem.
Sure, but if you say the word poem to someone on the street, they are immediately going to think of something with meter and rhyme.
Exactly. Like if you take a massive 1,000-page prose novel like War and Peace and try to call it a poem, people are going to look at you like you've completely lost your mind.
They'll think you're abusing ordinary language. Precisely. The word poem just carries way too much baggage. But if you try to get around that baggage to be perfectly technically accurate, you end up using these incredibly clunky, cacophonous phrases. You find yourself having to call a novel a hypothetical verbal structure.
It just rolls right off the tongue. I mean, I can't wait to recommend the new Stephen King hypothetical verbal structure to my friends.
Right. It's terrible jargon.
But this lack of precision doesn't just stop at the name of the artwork itself. It extends to the building blocks of the art, specifically the word symbol.
Okay, yeah.
In everyday conversation, when we say symbol, we usually mean like a hidden meaning. We think of it as a secret code we had to crack. But for the sake of our exploration today, we really need to redefine it.
How so?
Well, the source text defines a symbol simply as any unit of a literary structure that can be isolated for critical analysis.
Wait, so literally anything?
Anything. I mean, it could be a whole paragraph, a single phrase, a recurring image of a bird, or, get this, even the literal letters a writer uses to create a specific sound in an alliteration.
Wow. Yeah, if you can distinguish it and analyze how it functions in the work, it is a symbol.
Okay, so criticism is essentially the systematizing of these symbols. But here's where the problem gets really sticky for me. Literature isn't just a one-dimensional activity, right?
Not at all.
Like, have you ever read a book when you were a teenager and then you picked it up again, say, 10 years later, and it felt like a completely different book?
Oh, absolutely. All the time.
The words didn't change, obviously, but your understanding of the work itself grew. You didn't just learn new random facts about the plot. The actual structure of its meaning seemed to expand.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this phenomenon is what critics call polysemous meaning.
Polysemous.
Right, manifold meaning. It's an idea that stretches all the way back to Dante. Literature inherently exists on multiple levels simultaneously.
Oh, that makes sense.
This is exactly why you can have Freudian critics, Marxist critics, historical critics, and feminist critics all looking at the exact same novel and finding completely different symbols to analyze.
Right, and they aren't necessarily wrong.
Exactly. They aren't wrong. They are just tuning into different frequencies, different contexts, or what we can call different phases of meaning.
And to understand these different phases, we first have to look at the mechanics of our own attention when we read. This was a massive aha moment for me in the reading.
Oh, the two directions.
Yes. When we are reading, our attention is actually moving in two distinct directions at the exact same time.
Yes. The centrifugal direction and the centripetal direction.
Let's break those down because they are crucial to everything else we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
So centrifugal is the outward direction. Think of a centrifuge spinning outward.
Right.
In this mode, we keep going outside our reading. We look at the words on the page, and we immediately connect them to the things they mean in the real world, like our cat example from the intro.
Exactly.
The word points to your memory, your sensory experience of an actual physical animal. In the centrifugal direction, words are acting as signs. They point away from the page and out into the world.
And normally, we value this kind of writing for its accuracy and its truth. I mean, if a newspaper article says, "The sky is blue," we subconsciously check that against our external reality, and we agree.
But then there's the centripetal direction, the inward movement.
Yes.
Here, we aren't trying to connect the words to the outside world at all. We are trying to develop from the words a sense of the larger verbal pattern they make with each other.
Right. It's about the connections.
The word cat isn't primarily a symbol of a physical animal in this mode. It is a motif. It connects to other words in the text to form an internal structure. It doesn't represent, it connects.
I love how you phrased that.
Okay, I want to try out an analogy here to see if I'm fully grasping this. Tell me if this works.
Let's hear it.
Centrifugal reading, the outward kind, is like looking through a clear glass window to check the weather outside. You don't really care about the glass itself, you know.
Right.
In fact, the better the glass is, the less you even notice it. You only care about the information it's giving you about the street outside. Accuracy is all that matters.
That's a great way to put it.
But centripetal reading, the inward kind, is like looking at a stained glass window. You aren't trying to see the street behind it at all.
No, not at all.
You are looking at the pattern of the glass, the way the colors interact, the lid lines connecting the different shapes. You are appreciating the structure of the window itself.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it. I mean, it really is. And we can see this dynamic play out across different types of texts, too. Consider a dictionary.
Okay.
A dictionary is the ultimate centrifugal text. It is entirely a table of conventional outward sign values. You never sit down and read a dictionary for its plot or its internal emotional resonance.
Right. There's no character arc for the letter B.
Exactly. You only use it to connect a word to an external meaning. Literature, however, operates differently. Literature is an autonomous verbal structure. While it uses words that point outward, its final, ultimate direction of meaning is inward. It is the stained glass window.
And looking at literary history through this lens clarifies so many debates. Like in the 19th century, there was a whole movement called documentary naturalism writers like Émile Zola or Theodore Dreiser.
Oh, yeah.
They were basically trying to push literature as far in the centrifugal outward direction as it could possibly go without completely dissolving into like a sociology textbook.
Right. They wanted their novels to be judged almost entirely on the accuracy of their social descriptions. They wanted that clear glass.
But because art is cyclical, that extreme outward push created a massive tension. And eventually, that tension snapped and the pendulum swung violently in the opposite direction.
Which gave rise to the symbolism movement in France.
Exactly. Writers like Mallarmé, Rimbaud, Valéry, and later poets like T.S. Eliot in English, they focused almost entirely on the inward centripetal pattern.
Yes. For the symbolists, poetic images aren't there to state facts or point to external social conditions. The images point to each other to suggest or evoke a mood. It becomes entirely about incantation, not assertion.
So if we accept this premise, that literature's primary defining direction is inward, that it's this autonomous stained glass window that fundamentally disrupts how we define words like true and literal.
It really does.
Because in everyday life, if something is literally true, it means it actually happened. It is historically factual.
Yeah.
But if literature is pointing inward, what does literal even mean anymore?
This raises a profoundly important question, and it's one we just have to address head on. It brings us to the central paradox of literature. Literature consistently ignores facts, but it isn't lying.
Okay.
There's a famous quote from the Renaissance poet Sir Philip Sidney: "The poet never affirmeth." Because the poet isn't claiming to affirm a historical or scientific fact, the poet does not lie any more than the poet tells the truth. The meaning in literature is fundamentally hypothetical.
A hypothesis, like in science or math.
Precisely.
A pure mathematician sets up a hypothesis like, let x equal 5, and the rest of the equation depends entirely on conformity to that initial postulate. It doesn't matter if x physically exists in the real world.
No, it doesn't matter at all.
The poet does the exact same thing. And the perfect example of this is the ghost in Shakespeare's Hamlet.
I love this example. The appearance of the ghost in the first act presents a hypothesis to the reader. Let there be a ghost in this version of Denmark.
Right.
The brilliance of the play depends entirely on how the characters and the plot react to that postulate. It has absolutely nothing to do with whether ghosts actually exist in the real world, or even whether Shakespeare or his Elizabethan audience believed they did.
Right. If you are a reader who constantly quarrels with the postulate, if you sit in the theater and say, well, I don't like Hamlet because ghosts aren't real, or it's totally unrealistic that people in Denmark walk around speaking in perfect iambic pentameter, then you are completely missing the point of the art form.
You're totally missing it. You are failing to distinguish fiction from fact.
You're trying to look through the stained glass window to check the weather. There is this hilarious comparison made in the text about literal-minded readers. They are like the people in the early days of radio soap operas who would get so emotionally invested that they would send real physical checks in the mail to the radio station to help relieve the financial suffering of the fictional heroines.
It's so funny, but it's a perfect example. It is a fundamental failure to understand the accepted postulate, the underlying contract agreed upon between the reader and the text.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to that slippery word, literal. Traditionally, going all the way back to medieval theology, literal meaning meant historical accuracy. For instance, when Dante was analyzing the book of Exodus, the literal level of meaning was the actual physical departure of the historical Israelites from Egypt.
But applying that theological definition of literal to literary criticism completely breaks down.
It shatters.
Because a historical event cannot literally be anything other than a historical event.
Correct.
And a poem can literally only be a poem. So if a teacher asks a student, what does this poem mean literally? And the student gives a flat prose paraphrase of the plot like, oh, it's about a guy walking in the woods and choosing a path, they are actually wrong.
They are entirely wrong, because a prose paraphrase abstracts a secondary outward meaning from the text. It translates the centripetal structure into a centrifugal sign.
Right.
In literary criticism, reading literally means understanding the whole inner structure of interlocking motifs. It means completely surrendering your mind and your senses to the impact of the work as a singular whole. The literal basis of meaning in poetry can only be its letters, its words, its internal structure.
It's a shift from the reality principle to the pleasure principle.
Yes.
Like in assertive centrifugal writing, say, a manual on how to fix a car, the goal of instructing you is prior to entertaining you. But in literature, the act of contemplating that detached autonomous pattern of words is what creates pleasure first and foremost.
Even an after-dinner speaker, who is giving a very assertive, factual harangue, will suddenly digress and tell a joke.
Right.
A joke is a self-contained verbal structure. They use it just to arouse interest and pleasure.
We see this in historical writing, too. Think of immensely popular narrative histories, like Edward Gibbon's The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. We don't read Gibbon today because his facts are the most up-to-date, I mean, modern archaeology has totally surpassed him.
Right, we read him for his style.
Exactly. We read him because of the incredible engaging verbal pattern he created. The aesthetic pleasure has outlived the factual utility.
It really has.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. And I want to push back on this a little bit, make sure I'm not getting lost in the theory.
Sure, go for it.
If you are saying that a poem doesn't describe things rationally or historically, and its primary direction is always inward, doesn't that just mean poetry is a bunch of self-indulgent emotional venting?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Like, is the literal core of a poem just a cri de cure, a raw cry from the heart, like a dog howling at the moon because it feels sad, and we were just listening to the howl? Why should I care about an author's private, irrational feelings?
It's a very common pushback and a very natural assumption to make when we strip away the requirement for factual accuracy. But we must firmly reject that theory.
Sure.
If poetry were just a direct biological statement of a nervous organism confronted with something that demands an emotional response, then a complex poem like Milton's Allegro would just be a very long, convoluted way of saying, I feel happy right now.
Which it clearly isn't. I mean, it's a highly structured piece of art.
Exactly. The real core of poetry is a subtle, elusive, and highly constructed verbal pattern that deliberately avoids those bald, direct statements of feeling. Historically speaking, the earliest, most foundational forms of literary expression aren't diaries of subjective feelings. They are the riddle, the oracle, and the spell.
Oh, wow. That's fascinating. A spell or a riddle. That implies a puzzle, a pattern, a structure of words that actively turns away from obvious descriptive meaning to create an effect.
Yes, and that intentional turning away from direct statement is the very basis of irony. Literature is inherently ironic on the literal level because what it says is almost always different in kind or degree from what it means.
Right, there's a gap there.
In normal discursive writing, what you say tends to directly approximate what you mean. In literature, there is always that gap, a space, and it is within that gap that the centripetal pattern, the art itself, emerges.
That makes so much sense. So we've established this new sense of literal meaning, the unity of the word structure itself. And we've established the descriptive meaning, how those words relate to the outside world as signs.
Yeah.
This brings us naturally to the next major phase of our deep dive, what we can call the formal phase. This is where the symbol stops being just a little motif or a pointing sign, and it elevates into an image.
This phase is crucial because it is where we try to resolve the massive tension between the inward and outward directions we discussed. When we talk about form in literature, we are actually implying both directions.
How so?
Well, on one hand, form implies the literal unity of the structure, how the parts fit together. But on the other hand, it also implies content and matter, what the poem shares with external nature. A poem is not natural in its form. I mean, nature doesn't write in stanzas, but it relates itself naturally to nature. It acts as a kind of second nature.
And to really grasp this, we have to borrow a little bit from Aristotle. I'm going to try to explain. Like, I'm 5 here, so jump in if I mess this up.
I'm ready.
Aristotle talks about mimesis praxios, which translates to the imitation of an action. Now, we often associate this with mythos, or the narrative, the plot. But human action in the real world is primarily imitated by history.
Right.
When a historian writes a biography, they are directly imitating an action. A mythos in literature, however, is a secondary imitation. A novel doesn't describe specific real actions, it describes typical actions.
That's a perfect breakdown. And it applies to thought as well. Human thought is primarily imitated by discursive rating essays, philosophy, arguments that make specific predications about the world.
Right, the clear window again.
But literature gives us what Aristotle called dianoia, or meaning. This is a secondary imitation of thought. It's not the thought itself, it's an imitation of the process of thought. It captures the images, the metaphors, the associations, and the verbal ambiguities out of which ideas actually develop.
Which is such a relief to hear because actual human thought is a profoundly messy process.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, when I'm thinking through a problem, it's not a perfectly logical essay in my head. It's emotional entanglements, irrational convictions, moments of panic, weird inertia, and then sudden flashes of insight. If you read a character's internal monologue in a novel, and it sounds perfectly logical and grammatically correct, it feels fake.
It totally does. The art is in imitating the chaotic process.
So, to synthesize this, form is the narrative moving through time, the mythos, and the meaning holding it together simultaneously in space, the dianoia.
There is a musical analogy that is incredibly helpful for visualizing this dual nature of form. Think of a complex musical composition.
Okay.
It has the exact same form when we study the spread out sheet music on a desk as it does when we sit in a concert hall and listen to it performed over time. The mythos, the narrative, is the dianoia in movement playing out second by second.
Right.
The dianoia, the meaning, is the mythos in stasis, the entire structure held in your mind at once.
So when a formal critic looks at a poem through this lens, they are isolating symbols that show an analogy of proportion between the poem and the nature it is imitating. That specific symbol becomes the image.
Exactly.
And right here, right as we start talking about meaning and form, we hit one of the absolute biggest stumbling blocks in all of literary criticism, the intentional fallacy.
It is a massive hurdle and one that almost every reader struggles with.
I know I do.
The intentional fallacy is the ingrained notion that a poet's primary job, their main intention, is to convey a specific hidden meaning to a reader, and therefore the critic's first duty is to play detective and recapture that specific intention.
We all do it. Every single one of us. You read a confusing, ambiguous book, you get to the end, and you immediately think, okay, but what was the author trying to tell me? What is the moral of the story?
Right.
But the argument here is that the word intention implies aiming at a target, like a missile. And that only applies to discursive, centrifugal writing, where hitting the target of external reality is the whole goal. A poet's intention is completely different.
A poet's intention is tautological. It circles back on itself. Their intention is simply to put words together. Their intention is centripetally directed toward creating the work of art itself, not sending a coded message.
There is a hilarious thought experiment in the text that illustrates how absurd our obsession with authorial intent really is.
The Shakespeare one.
Yes. Imagine for a moment that we had the magical privilege to conjure up the ghost of William Shakespeare. He's standing right in front of us. And we ask this ghost, William, please settle this 400-year-old debate. What did you mean by this one highly debated, ambiguous passage in Hamlet?
We expect him to give us a clean, secret prose paraphrase.
Exactly. But he wouldn't. The ghost would just look at us and give the maddeningly repetitive answer, I meant it to form part of the play.
Because that is the only true answer. The final completed work is the definitive record of the writer's intention.
Right.
There's a brilliant old New Yorker cartoon that captures the psychology of this perfectly. A sculptor is standing in his studio looking at a statue of a woman he just finished carving. He turns to his friend and says, yes, the head is too large. When I put it in the exhibition, I shall call it the woman with the large head.
He is rationalizing his aesthetic choice, or his mistake after the fact.
Precisely. That is painfully true to the creative process. Authors change their minds constantly, they rationalize their mistakes, they let unconscious habits dictate their writing.
Yet if we approach a poem as if it's just an incomplete puzzle, and our only job is to guess what was in the dead author's head on a Tuesday in 1842, we are totally lost. What the poet meant to say is, quite literally, the poem itself.
And because literal meaning is variable and inherently ambiguous, the relationship of any one passage to the rest of the play creates myriads of new meanings that the author could never have consciously planned.
Oh, for sure.
Think of a vivid, minimalist sketch of a cat by a master artist. With just a few crisp black lines, they can capture the entire essence of feline movement. Similarly, a work like Hamlet contains an amount of meaning that centuries of criticism applied by brilliant minds from entirely different cultural contexts cannot exhaust.
Right. Shakespeare couldn't have intended a Marxist reading of Hamlet, but the structure he built supports it.
Exactly.
So what does this actually mean for us as everyday readers or as critics? I mean, if the poet isn't giving us a secret message to decode and we are just examining this autonomous structure of imagery, what is commentary? When we sit around discussing a book, what are we actually doing?
It's a humbling realization, but essentially all commentary is a form of allegorical interpretation.
Really?
Yeah. The instant a critic or a reader says, in Hamlet, Shakespeare appears to be portraying the tragedy of irresolution, they have begun to allegorize. They are actively attaching external ideas and concepts to the internal structure of poetic imagery.
And this leads us to the concept of the sliding scale of allegory, because clearly not all allegory is created equal. We've all read books where the allegory feels insulting and others where it feels profound. This scale maps out the spectrum, starting at the bottom with what we can call naive allegory.
Right. Naive allegory is basically disguised discursive writing. It's an argument wearing a cheap costume. Its center of gravity is entirely outward, pictorial, and transient.
Like what?
Think of a schoolroom morality play or a local civic pageant designed to entertain a visiting politician. something with characters literally named sound government, sedition, and discord.
Oh, it's incredibly on the nose. The image is just a thin, transparent wrapper for a specific idea.
Mhm.
And the major flaw of naive allegory is that it ages incredibly quickly.
It dates so fast.
Why does it age so poorly compared to other types of imagery? Is it because naive allegory is like a lock that only accepts one specific historical key?
That's a good way to look at it.
Like a political cartoon from the 1890s?
Mhm.
If you don't know the exact historical figures being caricatured, the image is entirely meaningless. The door is shut. Whereas the imagery preferred by modern writers, what is referred to as a heraldic symbol, is more like a prism.
A prism, I like that.
Yeah, it doesn't have one key. It catches whatever light the current reader brings to it and refracts it.
That prism analogy perfectly captures the difference. Naive allegory forcefully prescribes the direction of your commentary. It forces you down one single narrow path. But as we move along the sliding scale, things get more complex. We hit continuous allegory, like Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene or John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. These are indisputable masterworks, but they still prescribe a specific allegorical direction.
Okay, what's next on the scale?
Then we move into freestyle allegory, like the plays of Henrik Ibsen or the writings of Goethe, where the allegorical nature is picked up and dropped at the author's pleasure, keeping the reader on their toes.
And finally, on the far end of the scale, we find the anti-allegorical, ironic imagery. This is the sweet spot for modern literature and modern criticism. This is where your prism lives.
Exactly.
This includes things like the metaphysical conceit, where normally disparate, unrelated things are violently forced together to create a new image. It includes T.S. Eliot's famous objective correlative, and crucially, it includes the heraldic symbol.
The heraldic symbol is usually the central emblematic image in a modern work. Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, Herman Melville's Great White Whale, Virginia Woolf's Lighthouse.
Yes. Think about Moby Dick. When you read that novel, you don't think of a one-to-one allegorical mapping where the white whale equals exactly one specific historical concept, like the French Revolution or the gold standard.
No, it's way too vast for that.
Exactly. The heraldic symbol exists in a paradoxical, almost ironic relation to the narrative. As a unit of meaning, it arrests the narrative. It stops the forward momentum of the plot and forces you to just contemplate it. But as a unit of narrative, it perplexes the meaning. It combines an intrinsic, unresolvable mystery with a pointer to something completely outside itself.
And this brings up a vital concept in art: mystery. Where does the mystery of great art come from? We can draw a distinction between extrinsic and intrinsic symbols.
What's the difference?
Well, an extrinsic symbol is something like a national flag or a red traffic light. It has very little inherent aesthetic value. It is just a sign for something else. Its mystery is simply the mystery of the unknown essence it points to.
But the intrinsic symbol, the work of art itself, is a mystery that remains a mystery no matter how fully you know it or how many times you read it. The mystery in the greatness of Shakespeare's King Lear doesn't come from Shakespeare concealing a secret code in the text that we haven't cracked yet.
No, not at all.
The mystery comes from revelation. It comes from something unlimited and expansive within the structure of the work itself.
Exactly. And we must be very careful not to try to explain away this intrinsic mystery by relying on biological or psychological cliches. We do this all the time.
You really do.
We use the word creative with biological analogies. We say a poet gave birth to a poem, or that the novel grew organically like a plant. But describing a tulip blooming from the inside of the plant requires us to project human consciousness onto the flower. Saying nature knows when to bloom is just importing a faded, ancient mother goddess cult into modern biology.
And we absolutely shouldn't do that to poetry either. We shouldn't try to explain literary facts by guessing at the subconscious, murky mental processes of the author. A snowflake has no conscious intention of forming a beautiful symmetrical crystal, but the crystal is still a profound structure that is worth studying in its own right.
It absolutely is.
And seeing how these individual crystals form leads us perfectly into the next major leap in our deep dive, the mythical phase.
Right, this is where our perspective widens dramatically. Up until now, in the formal phase, we were essentially looking at the poem as a unique, isolated artifact. But a poem is never truly isolated. It is also one of a class of similar forms.
Meaning what exactly?
Well, when Aristotle analyzed Oedipus Rex, he knew it was a unique masterpiece, but he also knew it belonged to a broader class of literature called tragedy. To truly understand tragedy, we have to look beyond the individual poem. We have to look at the external relations and the connective tissue between poems.
And in this phase, our symbol graduates once again. It becomes the archetype.
The archetype.
An archetype is a communicable unit, a typical or recurring image that connects one poem to another and unifies our entire literary experience.
Entering this phase deals a heavy, necessary blow to what we can call the modern prejudice of originality. In the last few centuries, we have developed this deeply romanticized notion of the solitary genius.
Oh, big time.
We picture the brilliant author sitting down with a sharpened pencil and a blank piece of paper, creating a completely new, unprecedented masterpiece out of thin air, creating ex nihilo.
It's the low mimetic prejudice, and the reality is that human beings just do not create that way. Think about the birth of a new baby. A new baby is not an entirely new, unprecedented creation dropped from the sky.
No, of course not.
It is deeply conditioned by a hereditary and environmental kinship to a society that already exists. It shares DNA, it will learn an existing language, it will adopt cultural norms. It is society appearing once again as a unit of individuality.
Literature operates in the exact same manner. A new poem is born into an already existing vast order of words. It manifests something that was already latent in that order. Literature shapes itself. It is not shaped externally by a single mind.
So it's not just one genius.
No. As radical as it sounds, poetry can only be made out of other poems. Novels can only be made out of other novels.
Which feels almost scandalous to say out loud in our modern era of copyright law.
It really does.
Copyright law has essentially disguised the conventional, deeply communal nature of art. It forces us to treat every book like a patented mechanical invention. It creates this weird dynamic where tracing an author's influences is considered prestigious scholarship if the authors have been dead for 200 years, but if they are alive today, we call it moral delinquency or plagiarism.
It creates a totally distorted value system. We end up looking for a poet's greatness in the tiny residual sliver of originality they added, rather than acknowledging the massive, brilliant structural conventions they inherited and utilize. This modern prejudice makes it very difficult for readers to properly appraise some of the greatest authors in history. Take Geoffrey Chaucer, who translated and paraphrased constantly, or Shakespeare, who sometimes followed his historical source material almost verbatim, or John Milton, who gleefully stole as much imagery as possible from the Bible and classical antiquity.
I love the example of Milton because it proves this point so perfectly. When Milton sat down to write an elegy for his friend Edward King, who had drowned at sea, the famous poem Lycidas, he didn't ask himself, what can I, John Milton, personally say about the subjective feeling of losing my friend Edward?
No, that wasn't his primary concern.
Right. He asked, how does the institution of poetry require that such a profound subject should be treated? He intentionally submitted himself to the convention, and yet Lycidas is universally considered one of the greatest, most moving poems in the English language.
Because true originality doesn't mean inventing something from nothing. True originality means returning to the origins of literature, just as political radicalism technically means returning to the roots of a problem. T.S. Eliot famously remarked that a good poet is more likely to steal than to imitate.
Why steal instead of imitate?
Because stealing actively involves the new poem with specific past poems, building a bridge, rather than just vaguely imitating a general style.
Because of copyright, modern authors are forced to steal titles instead of plots. That's why we have Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, William Faulkner's The Sound and the Fury.
Right, they can't steal the plot without getting sued.
Exactly. So they grab these incredibly resonant phrases from John Donne, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, and Shakespeare to infuse their modern stories with that impersonal dignity and communism of convention.
We can push that biological metaphor of the baby to its logical conclusion here. If nature, the raw, lived experience of the author, is the mother of the poem, providing the content, who is the father?
Okay, who?
If we assume the individual poet is the father, we are slipping back into confusing literature with discursive writing. We are back to authorial intent. The poet is not the father. The poet is, at best, a midwife, or perhaps the womb of Mother Nature herself.
Her private's he, which is a fantastically cheeky way to put it. The poet has to suffer to give birth to the poem, but if the poem is truly alive, it desperately wants to be cut loose from the author's ego. The true father of the poem is the form of the poem itself, the universal spirit of poetry that has existed for millennia.
which perfectly explains why poets historically always open their epics by appealing to the muses or to Apollo or to the Holy Spirit. They intuitively felt they were in a receptive, subservient relation to a shaping spirit that existed outside of themselves.
Okay, wait, I've challenged this because if we follow this logic all the way down, it sounds like you were saying literature is just a closed-loop echo chamber.
I can see why it sounds like that.
Yeah, I mean, if novels are only made out of other novels, and the forms of literature can't exist outside of literature, just like the sonata form can't exist outside of music, doesn't real life matter? Doesn't the author's actual heartbreaking or joyous life experience mean anything at all to the final product?
It matters immensely, but we have to maintain a crucial distinction. Literature absolutely relies on life, reality, historical experience, social conditions, and physical nature for its content. But its forms are not made out of those things.
Okay.
The raw material is the chaos of human life, but the architectural blueprint used to build the house is always literature.
Ah, okay, that clarifies it. The blueprint is the convention. The bricks are real life. And recognizing those blueprints, those conventions, is what allows us to study literature not as a pile of random books, but as a cohesive whole. There's this incredible claim that you can get an entire liberal education simply by picking up one conventional poem, like Milton's Lycidas, and following its specific archetypes as they stretch out, like roots, into the rest of human literature.
It is a breathtaking lineage to trace. Lycidas is written in the form of a pastoral elegy. If you trace that specific form back, you arrive at Theocritus in ancient Greece.
Wow.
And Theocritus didn't invent it from nothing. He adapted it from the actual physical ritual laments for the dying agricultural god Adonis. Then that form is adopted by the Roman poet Virgil. Along the way, it gathers up the pastoral shepherding symbolism of the Judeo-Christian Bible Abel the Shepherd, the 23rd Psalm, Christ the Good Shepherd.
Which introduces the whole ecclesiastical overtone of the word pastor and the congregation as a flock.
Precisely. And then that enriched river flows into the Renaissance with Spenser, Sidney, and Shakespeare's forest comedies. It flows down into the Romantic era with Shelley, and all the way into the modern era with Walt Whitman and Dylan Thomas. Following that one single archetype connects you inextricably to the entire history of Western thought and religion.
And the craziest part is that even when a poet actively tries to resist this archetypal pull, they can't.
No, they really can't.
Walt Whitman is famous for being the great American anti-archetypal poet. He literally urged the muse to pack her bags, forget the old tired themes of Troy and Greece, and write exclusively about the immediate, gritty, contemporary American environment. And he was right to demand new contemporary content.
Sure, content needs to be updated.
But when Whitman actually sat down to write his masterpiece, the great elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, his underlying form was just as deeply conventional as Milton's Lycidas. He used the imagery of the purple flowers laid on coffins, the drooping western star, the cyclical return of spring to represent rebirth. The form didn't come from a newspaper report of the assassination. It came from the structural DNA of poetry itself.
And this brings us to a fascinating nuance about how archetypes actually operate in a text. They are not fixed, rigid signs with only one definition. They are defined as complex variables. They are associative clusters.
Like what?
Take the color green, for example. Green can symbolize hope or the rebirth of vegetable nature, or it can be a go sign in traffic, or it can symbolize Irish patriotism.
But at its core, as a literal verbal sign, it's just a color.
Exactly. There are no absolute, inherent, universal correspondences. There are very obvious, culturally ingrained ones, like darkness being associated with terror or light being associated with purity. But a skilled modern poet actively resists having their archetypes easily spotted and pinned down to just one dictionary interpretation. They want them to remain versatile and complex.
But, like water, the stream of literature seeks the easiest channels first. If a writer uses expected associations, they can communicate with the reader much more rapidly. And this leads to a counterintuitive point. If you want to study these archetypes, the best place to look isn't in complex avant-garde poetry. It's actually in highly conventionalized popular literature, naive literature.
It makes perfect sense when you think about it. If you want to explain the rudimentary foundational facts about counterpoint in music to a beginner, you don't start by dropping them into a complex Bach fugue. You start by having them sing Three Blind Mice in a round.
Yes. And the literary equivalent of Three Blind Mice is the incredibly ingrained convention of the two heroines in the 19th century novel. Once you see this archetype, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
In so many of these novels, there's a light heroine and a dark heroine.
The dark heroine is almost universally depicted as passionate, haughty, sometimes plain, often foreign or marked as an outsider, and she is frequently associated with the undesirable or some forbidden fruit, occasionally even incestuous overtones.
And the light heroine is the pure, acceptable societal ideal. And here is the rigid rule of the archetype. If the plot involves both of these heroines vying for the affection of the same hero, the story almost always has to get rid of the dark one for the story to end happily.
She has to go.
She either has to die, be exiled, or be safely neutralized by turning her into a platonic sister figure. It happens in Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. It happens in James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans. It happens in Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White. There's even an argument that a male version of this exact dynamic forms the entire symbolic foundation of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights.
And the authors of these incredibly diverse books weren't holding secret meetings to coordinate this rule. It was a confused, largely unconscious approach to a convention that was simply in the literary air they breathed. When Spencer wrote about the Red Cross Knight, he explicitly, consciously knew he was employing conventional Christian archetypes. But when a later writer uses similar imagery of light and dark, they might be completely unaware of the deep, ancient archetypal resonance they are tapping into.
And tracing that unconscious resonance leads us to the final, and I think the most profound peak of this deep dive, Section 6, Ritual and Dream. We have moved from the literal sound of a single word to the formal image imitating thought, to the mythical archetype connecting different poems. Now we pull all the way back to look at the narrative and the meaning of literature as a whole, singular human project.
In this final archetypal phase, the narrative aspect of literature, the plot, is studied as a recurrent act of symbolic communication. It is studied as ritual.
Ritual, not just Aristotle's imitation of a single action, but an imitation of human action as a whole. When you apply archetypal analysis to a plot, you stop looking at the specific details and start looking for the underlying generic actions. You look for the weddings, the funerals, the intellectual initiations, the mock executions, the cyclical chasing away of the scapegoat villain to cleanse the society.
Ritual is fundamentally an act expressive of a dialectic. It is the physical manifestation of the push and pull of human desire and human repugnance. We invent rituals for fertility, for marriage, for victory, which all express our deepest desires. And conversely, we invent rituals to ward off drought or enemies, rituals of expulsion, punishment, and sacrifice, which express our deepest repugnance.
And if the narrative plot is ritual, then the meaning, the significant content of literature is studied as dream, the eternal conflict of human desire and harsh reality.
Dream operates on a parallel dialectic to ritual. On one side, you have the wish fulfillment dream, the vision of the golden age, which corresponds directly to the rituals of desire. And on the other side, you have the anxiety dream, the nightmare, the vision of the wasteland, which corresponds to the rituals of repugnance.
So literature, viewed in its ultimate archetypal aspect, is the union of ritual and dream, translated into a form of verbal communication. It is human civilization's way of organizing its deepest, most primal desires and its most terrifying existential fears into communicable patterns.
That's beautifully said.
This realization completely liberates us as readers. We're no longer just reacting to a story about a specific depressed Danish prince named Hamlet or a specific angry captain chasing a whale named Moby Dick. We are seeing the hidden architecture of human civilization itself. We're seeing the ancient rituals of the scapegoat, the recurring nightmares of the deep, the cyclical rhythms of the seasons translated into the order of words.
And witnessing that translation creates a specific emotional response that we can call exuberance or buoyancy. The traditional Aristotelian theory of catharsis in tragedy is often misunderstood. It isn't about making the audience literally clinically depressed.
Right.
If you watch a great, devastating tragedy and you leave the theater feeling merely dismal and crushed, either the playwright failed, the actors failed, or your response failed. The blinding of Gloucester in King Lear is horrifying, but it is technically entertainment. Not because we are sadists who enjoy suffering, but because the transmutation of that terrible, chaotic experience into mimesis, into a structured work of art, liberates us. It raises us on a wave of exhilaration.
Exuberance is beauty, as the poet William Blake said. When we experience great art, even tragic art, we are presented with the vision of a decisive act of spiritual freedom. We see humanity imposing structure on chaos.
We have covered an immense amount of conceptual ground today.
We really have. Let's try to synthesize this journey, not just as a list, but as a shift in how we perceive the world. We started by acknowledging the sheer frustration of not even having the right vocabulary to talk about literature. We learned the vital difference between centrifugal reading, where we look through the window for facts, and centripetal reading, where we stop to admire the stained glass pattern of the words themselves.
We discovered that poets are, in the best possible sense, licensed liars who build hypothetical worlds, and that searching for a hidden prose paraphrase intention in their work is a fundamental trap.
We saw how our commentary on a book is always a form of allegory, and how that allegory slides from fragile, naive historical pageants to the complex, prism-like heraldic symbols of modern novels. And finally, we uncovered the incredible truth that the greatest works of literature aren't created out of nothing by solitary geniuses.
No, they are brilliant communal recyclers.
They are built out of ancient conventions, archetypes, rituals, and dreams. They are the latest born children of the universal spirit of poetry.
It is a framework that completely and permanently reshapes how you interact with a text. But there is a final, broader implication here that I think builds on what this theory of symbols has given us, and it extends far beyond the pages of a novel.
Where are you going with this?
Well, the foundational argument here is that the inward meaning of literature, the self-contained matrix of hypothetical archetypes, requires an axiom of faith. You have to assume the distinction between an empirical fact and an illusion just to function as a reader. But look closely at the modern world we are living in right now. Our reality is becoming increasingly virtual, algorithmic, and saturated with relentless media narratives.
Oh, wow.
Think about the structures that govern our daily lives. Perhaps this theory of symbols isn't just a tool for analyzing old books anymore. What if the political narratives we are fed on the news, the carefully curated social media personas we interact with, and the exhausting cultural battles we engage in every single day are actually operating on these exact same ancient literary archetypes?
That's terrifying.
What if the algorithms controlling our feeds are deliberately serving us the dark heroine to hate, or the scapegoat villain to expel? Because those are the precise rituals and dreams that drive human engagement and emotional response. What if understanding the mythical phase of poetry is no longer just an academic exercise for literature students in a classroom, but is actually the essential critical survival skill required for navigating modern reality itself?
That is a staggering, terrifying, and totally brilliant thought. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, if the whole world is essentially being written and presented to us like a massive algorithmic novel, you better know how to read the underlying archetypes or you are going to get completely swept away by the plot.
Exactly.
Thank you for taking this incredibly deep dive with us into the architecture of meanings. The next time you open a book, or honestly, the next time you open your news feed or social media app, I encourage you to stop looking through the window for just a second. Take a step back, look at the lead lines, look at the colors, and really examine the stained glass.